Welcome to the Exponential Minds Podcast. The research, development, launch, and growth of new technologies is creating incredible momentum in the modern world. Join futurist Nicholas Badminton as he talks with the innovators and the exponential minds that are tackling some of the biggest problems and creating solutions that are propelling humanity to the next level.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Exponential Minds Podcast. My name is Nicholas Badminton. I'm a futurist. I help my clients look out 5, 10, 20 plus years into the future so they can do better strategic planning and anticipate risk today. And I'm incredibly excited to kick off this next season of the Exponential Minds Podcast with Karl Schroeder. Karl is the author of 11 science fiction novels, including the award winners Permanence and Lockstep. His latest book, Stealing Worlds, is a near-future thriller about augmented reality, live-action role-playing, murder, and groceries, amongst other things. Aside from writing, Karl also consults as a futurist, having attained a master's in Strategic Foresight and Innovation back in 2011. He's currently working on multiple writing and foresight projects, and he lives in Toronto with his wife and his daughter. And Karl, I'm hugely excited to chat to you today. We've seen each other pass through the channels of cyberspace many times. This is the first time I'm chatting to you, so I'm excited, and welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me on the show.
So we keep things fairly casual here, and this is a open discussion. So rather than me saying, here's a question, and then you answer, we really get into it and just go back and forth and keep things nice and easy. But really, as I always do with all of my podcast episodes, it's really useful for people listening in to sort of understand where we all came from. So really, to where you are today and the work that you do, and you've got a very impressive, resume, as it were, and many books behind you, and you've worked with a lot of great clients and been a guest in the White House and a whole bunch of different things. Can you sort of tell us your professional journey to becoming a futurist?
Well, it was a roundabout one. And actually, it's been a two-step career for me. I started writing science fiction when I was 14 years old, which seemed like an obvious career choice because my mother had published two Christian nurse romances with Zondervan books when I was very, very small. And I grew up seeing those in the bookshelf. So naturally, everybody wrote books, so I would too. Right. It took me another 25 years or so to publish one, but I met a lot of really great people along the way. And then in around 2000, just as my first book was coming out, I got invited down to Ottawa to attend a foresight conference that was being put on by Jack Smith, the National Science Council. And I did a few of those, and my job at that point was to be the wackiest person in the room, basically. You go into a room full of terrified bureaucrats and technologists and people who are being asked to think outside the box after having throughout their entire careers been told to think inside the box.
Right.
So they needed somebody as a lightning rod, and I served as that for a while, and then started doing more substantial work, culminating with these two sort of hybrid projects I did for the Canadian military, Crisis in Zephyr and Crisis in Earlier, which are both short novels that are also foresight explorations about the future of the Canadian military. And then after that, I got a degree in it. So it's
and you did that degree, where was that? Was that at OCAD in Toronto?
That's right. I was part of the first cohort in the OCAD Strategic Foresight and Innovation program. And that was a really wild ride because we had everything from there was a professional medical technologist, several film studies people, an AI fellow who worked for Wolfram Alpha, two science fiction writers, We were all sort of thrown together and came out the other side intact. It was good.
That kind of seems like a normal kind of cohort these days, though, right?
It is, particularly when you're talking futurist or foresight. There has never been an academy for that. This is a career that people wander into, and they wander into it from all kinds of different backgrounds, which has been, to this point, one of its strengths. That whenever you get a bunch of futurists in the same room, if you get 10 futurists, you get 100 viewpoints.
Right.
That is extraordinarily valuable. Now that there are degrees being offered in it, perhaps the danger is that it will become a thing rather than being something to be wandered into.
It's interesting. The word someone called me a futurist 8 years ago, and I was running conferences about humanity and technology, and before that I was doing advertising and starting to put like 3D printers into retail stores, and doing all sorts of funky stuff around like the future of manufacturing, whatever. But I was never calling myself a futurist. I'd only really ever sort of seen like the word in sort of the boundaries of society. I mean, I was already reading Jaron Lanier, I was already reading Rushkoff and people like that, but they weren't calling themselves futurist, right? It's almost like a word that it's given to you in a way that you have to earn, right?
Well, and it's also slightly disreputable. Now the thing is that I've been through this before, because when I went to the World Science Fiction Convention in Glasgow, Scotland, the newspapers touted a convention of foresighters that had come to town, which was really, made us sound great. But usually you are called by other people a sci-fi writer.
Right.
Oh, like those Star Trek guys, right? And you call yourself a speculative fiction author. So in futures work, there's something of a repeated pattern where other people call you a futurist and you just call yourself a foresight analyst. Call yourself whatever you want. I'm more interested in what you do and
right.
How unwacky you are prepared to be about it.
And that's interesting. I mean, I sort of went through, I did a lot of biohacking. I spoke about the future of sex and technology. I did a whole bunch of really sort of esoteric things, the biohacker, the weirdo in the room. And then suddenly you're stood up on stage in front of 3,000 people listening to you intently, because you're actually now, the strange views of the world are slightly more sensible, especially because as the world gets weird, our boats rise to the top, as it were. I really want to dive into talking a little bit about the work you did, if you don't mind, about this was back in 2005 with the Canadian Army. So Crisis in Zephyr, and there was a second book that you were talking about as well. And this is interesting to me. I always talk about the monomyth and the hero's journey, being able to build out these big stories. But it's rare. I've never been engaged by someone that said, can you write me a book, a fictional piece that's significant. I mean, the Crisis in Zephyr, I think, is about 160, 170 pages. It's like an anthology of its story, but it links to everything that you're talking about, so that it's inherently useful, right? Can you talk me through a little bit, like how you had that conversation, or did the client come to you and say, hey, can you write this book, and how that whole project came to pass?
Sure. The client did come to me. It was some people at the Land One, I believe, Defense. Let me see. I'll just pull it out.
The General Land Capability Development.
Yes, which doesn't sound very interesting. But
right.
They had been running a set of internal foresight studies. And this is not at all unusual for the Army. I mean, the military invented the scenario planning process, basically.
Yeah, it came from Rand in the late 60s, right?
Even before that, but Rand was the one who popularized it.
Right.
And so they had a set of very well-developed scenarios. But to sort of paraphrase what they said to me, they said, well, we want to find a way to present these in such a way that even a 4-star general can understand them.
Right.
And in fact, they were looking for a teaching tool. They were looking for something to give to people in officers training that would give them capacities that they might not use for 30 years, but basically priming them for a different way of thinking. And they had created 4 or 5 different scenarios for the future and chosen one that they wanted to present in a new format. And they had different options for that. So you could do film, for instance. You could gamify. They knew about my work, so they came to me to talk about writing a fiction long form about it. So we decided to do that, but not just as this sci-fi writer is going to write a book for us. It was this author is going to take the findings of the Foresight Project and present them in an entertaining way, such that when you come away from reading the story, you've learned all the stuff that's also in this stack of reports here. But you've done so in a seamless sort of manner. And although that's been done before, I'm not really aware of anything as thoroughgoing as these 2 projects turned out to be. Because you're right, at the end of each chapter, there are exercises, there are mountains of links to all of the technologies and ideas that are talked about in each chapter. So they don't stand alone as works of fiction. They are, thoroughly interconnected into the subjects that are being talked about.
I mean, that's a very modern form of storytelling as well. I mean, if we look at the internet, everyone's got like a 1-minute sort of attention span. It's memes, infographics, like short movies. I mean, advertising is like 5 seconds long and really effective like that, right? I mean, that kind of tells us what it's like. So to sit down and read a book, but when you do have people like in the military and they are looking at, strategic text. I mean, if you've ever sat down with Musashi's like Book of 5 Rings or Sun Tzu, they're very, if you think about it, these are ancient texts, like hundreds of years old in Musashi or I think about 2,000 or so years old in terms of Sun Tzu. But it's very digestible small pieces of content that relate to other pieces of content, and they're interlinked. So that's kind of interesting to think about, the memorable and entertaining nature of that writing as well.
Well, yes, and I ended up writing my thesis on my master's thesis on the technique that I developed for writing these books. I attempted to codify it in a way that non-experts would be able to follow along and write their own narratives in a similar fashion. But along the way, I learned some really interesting things about narrative itself.
Right.
So, for instance, Professor Brian Boyd at Auckland University wrote a book called On the Origin of Stories, which is about the evolutionary history of storytelling.
Right.
And he and some others claimed that, to use his words, narrative is the default mode of understanding of the human mind.
Right.
In other words, if you can translate something in your mind into a narrative form, your mind will automatically do it. And it seems that narrative is a deep human faculty for dealing with one-off events. So, for instance, you can write up all the math about tornadoes and model tornadoes in a computer, but each tornado is itself a unique thing. And the only way you can really understand a given tornado is by exploring it in terms of its history and context. And it turns out that if you describe something in terms of its history and context, well, that's a narrative.
And what's interesting is tornadoes have names as well.
Yeah, because they are what we call complex or similar to complex adaptive systems. In other words, systems, multi-agent systems, things that you might be able to describe really, really simply, but when they actually come into play, they are literally, can't be anticipated. They are chaotic. They are Politics is like that. Human beings in general are like that. That's why we use stories to talk about each other all the time. And we don't talk about the orbit of the Earth around the sun in narrative terms because there's no story there. It's utterly predictable. Stories are for the unpredictable. And when you talk about the future, that is, I've described the future as the dimension of surprise. Rather than thinking about it in terms of time, you can think of what foresight analysts or futurists or whatever you want to call them, what we do as being explorers of surprise.
Right.
And that dimension, which isn't necessarily in the future, because a lot of it, as William Gibson says, is here, but distributed unevenly. That's the surprising. And how you deal with surprise is incredibly important. And mostly we don't deal with it very well. So narrative is a deep, deep ancient technique for doing that. But there's a lot of other techniques, a lot of them developed in the 20th century, as you were saying, scenarios and so on and so forth, that have become part of a kind of science of surprise.
What's really interesting about this, and I'm thinking about this, I mean, when you think of a tornado, it's a distinct event. When you think about, a battle within a war, or a war, if the war isn't, a world war per se, then it's more easily digestible. When you start to think about hyper objects, the things that are very difficult to wrap your arms around, climate change, racism, these things that, they are just these huge things that it's difficult to wrap our heads around. It's very difficult to create a singular narrative across all of them, but there's almost families of stories and families of narratives within it, but it gets incredibly complex incredibly quickly, right?
Yes, but and arguably you can't tell a story about a hyper object any more than you can tell a story about the orbit of the Earth.
Right.
But exactly. I've been wanting to push the boundaries for a long time, and you mentioned sort of deep narratives and mythologies earlier in our conversation, and I've been interested in how you create stamp a new sort of vision on the future that allows people, gives them something to hang, a hook to hang their ideas on for things like climate change.
Right.
So my last novel, Stealing Worlds, was an attempt to do that. I created a notional new form of artificial intelligence that I call the deodand, as a way of, a new way maybe of thinking about climate change. The deodand being an artificial intelligence that thinks it is some natural system, such as a forest, a river, a pod of whales, and acts in the interests of that, in the human economy. So you have forests investing in the stock exchange, and you have a herd of elk hiring people to look after them, using money that they've made by selling tourist rights to their migration patterns. So in the novel, I've got a set of autonomous taxi cabs, self-driving cars, called Proudly Eagle Owned, that are owned by a blockchain corporation that thinks it is a set of eagle families in the Pacific Northwest. And all the profits from shuttling people around in these taxis go to protecting and advancing the interests of these eagles. So this is the kind of intervention that I'm doing lately as an artist slash foresighter. It's a very different approach. I don't know anybody else doing it, but it's kind of a design approach to giving people new ways to think about climate change in this case, or the environment.
Yeah, and it's a wildly creative approach as well. And you're not pointing fingers at people, and you're not saying those people over there are doing something bad, but we're not those people. By abstracting it even further, like the families of eagles, the notional, the AI that's a notional family of eagles that run self-driving taxi cabs that have got particular interests that are related to the well-being of the eagles and their families and the ecology that they live in and the environment that they live in. It gets really interesting, but this isn't how business leaders think, right? So how do you? No. I mean, how do you come in and start to introduce these wild ideas and really start to shift the mindset within, these. The business leaders think very sort of within some very strict boundaries of operations and governance and strategic principles as well.
Well, now we're coming to territory that I'm sure is very familiar to you as well. Dealing with business people, we all have to, right. Something like only 20% of CEOs admit to ever thinking about the future at all. There's some amazing statistics about, how little people and people in business, but not just them, think about the future. So I'm sure you've done the same thing as myself. You've been the wackiest person. And you've gone into a meeting with the intention to shake people out of their normal ways of thinking. And that's usually how it starts, with some way of finding out what the default future is, as I call it, or the status quo that's in people's heads, and then break it down. Show them in one way or the other that there will be no status quo,
right?
And that the default future just is not going to happen. Yeah. And once you get people to that point, then you can start having a conversation about what is or could happen. And it's not prediction. This is the mistake that a lot of people make, even when they're hiring us. They say, well, can you come in and predict some stuff for us? But that's not what we do.
Right.
Because we're dealing with the dimension of surprise. We're dealing with an intrinsically unpredictable aspect of the world that business people need to deal with. And it's the central dilemma. The future is absolutely unpredictable, and we absolutely must predict it. We're always on the horns of that dilemma, right? So what we try and do as a result is lead people down the path towards resilience in the face of surprise. And that's a very different thing than prediction, but it's something that you can make sense of as a business person, as a government person. Resilience is a pretty concrete concept. It's money in the bank. It's how many divisions in your company, right? It's how big a brain trust, how many patents have you got? It's your ability to take a shock and keep on going.
Yeah.
And when you get to that conversation, then it can be very smooth sailing.
I think maybe that's why so many people walk around and they say, oh, we are here to create our future, singular typically in a lot of entrepreneurs' minds anyway, or politicians' minds. What is the future? Where are we going to the future? I think, I read a tweet with Elon Musk, or there's some article where he's quoted around his Neuralink, and he's saying, in 10 years, we're not even going to need to talk to each other. And this hyperbole and these big promises, the Californian ideology around, creating something, selling it to everyone, and everyone living this amazing new world. And we know modern discussions within the Futurist Foresight community around colonization and how you can't just fit everyone into one particular trajectory is not a good thing for humanity. We end up, 280 years in this failing industrial complex, a constant state of collapse and decline, transformation a little bit here and there, continue collapse and decline in various parts of the world. I mean, was it a fifth of the American beef industry is offline right now because of a cyber attack that happened in the last couple of days? I mean, these kinds of things, and the leaders of these companies and organizations or whoever, governments, will say, well, we couldn't have imagined that coming, but surely we can imagine, we can imagine positive equitable futures, and that's what we try and create. And I love the ideas that you've put in Stealing World around, these sort of empathetic entities that think about something different from money in the bank, as it were. But when we do start to think about the futures that are inconvenient, maybe terrible, or something that's not gonna be good for the politicians or good for the companies or good for humanity as a whole, I mean, how do we tell those stories? I mean, are we always going to come out of the end of this with sailing over the horizon and everything's going to be good, or is there room in our world for stories that end up in a terrible place so that we can take some lessons from them?
Well, there's been an interesting thing that's happened, I think, in the last few generations, that the narrative about the future that business has remained very positivistic and very optimistic, even while the narrative that culture as a whole has about the future has become more and more depressive, perhaps, and dystopian. And if you look back 70 years, you'll find plenty of positive visions in science fiction about the future.
Right.
Nowadays, such visions are very, very hard to find. And it's not so much that people are being deliberately dystopic as that there is, again, a default future that has taken hold in the public imagination, if not an imagination of technocrats. And that is a strictly negative vision of the future. So when you go to deploy narrative, I think you sort of need to be aware of this strange dichotomy. There's several different audiences or several different sort of sets of stakeholders with regard to the future. And some of them are highly optimistic and some of them are highly pessimistic. And what we need, I think, is a balance and the ability to move between those two points of view for all of us. I've gone on record a number of times saying that science fiction has got to start developing more positive visions of the future.
Right.
And this is why, because deploying dystopia is extremely useful, but that can't be your default or only vision of what's possible.
But it's interesting, the default, if you think about it, whether you're thinking about Orwell's 1984, you're thinking about Aldous Huxley, or you're thinking about Heinlein, or in even modern filmmaking, I always like to talk about, there's Gattaca, there's Blade Runner, The Matrix, all of these sort of, very noir in the way that they're created, and but they're quite inherently complex as well. There's lots of layers to them, but there's positive in all stories. It's just that where people have dialed up the knob to 12 to say, this is the particular tone of the movie or the particular way that we look at things as well. So, I mean, what do we do to be more positive? I mean, do you think suddenly if you wrote a number of books that were nothing but positive, do you think that would sell as well as something that had a mix of both positive, negative? I mean, typically the hero's journey, you end up in an abyss and you have to have people helping you out of that, and then you have to come back and there's atonement, and then suddenly life is good. And pretty much you can look at any film and it follows that kind of flow in a way. But can we just skip the abyss and suddenly it's a really positive story from one end to the other?
Well, there's an old saying in theater: "Death is easy, comedy is hard," and it is so true. It's a lot easier to write a popular dystopia than a popular utopia. What I could see doing, and I've done this in various shades at different times, is to write something that is dark, but show that it didn't have to be.
Right.
And really the problem is when dystopia becomes the default future, right? When it becomes seen as inevitable, then by accepting that, you are effectively promoting it. And that is kind of what I rail against. But at the same time, what interests me is not the Pollyanna, everything will be great vision of the future. That again, a lot of business people have, because that's what works in business. What I'm interested in writing as a fiction writer now, completely outside of the realm of foresight, what I'm interested in writing is stories about have a well-earned optimism, to put it exactly. A well-earned optimism is way better than any kind of giddy hopefulness, right? And it's way better than dystopia. If you can find the reason to be optimistic, then you have a path forward. And so it's a carrot and stick situation. It's great to present people with the stick and say, don't go there, right? Don't build this future. But if you don't have an alternative to that, then they will say, well, I guess we've got to, and that's not what you want.
It's kind of interesting as well. I was watching a YouTube video by a guy called Van Niestat, and he was talking about his friend that was on this remote island, and they'd been stuck there for a year because of COVID and the pandemic. Everyone on the island was safe. They became friends with them. They decided to get married. The people on the island decided to resurrect an old way of celebrating marriage as an entire community, the entire island. Hundreds of people in attendance that they kind of never did because they were too busy, or it was too inconvenient for many people. And it's almost like that well-earned optimism for me is almost like the oldie world of ritual in a way, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously I grew up in England where there's lots of things like I grew up very close to Stonehenge, and you have the summer solstice, and there's definitely way fewer people there for the winter solstice, I'll be honest. but the ritual and the importance, but sometimes in society, people are pointing the fingers and saying, well, why are you doing that? That seems all a little bit silly. Druids, who are druids? But there's something really important about the stewardship of Mother Earth in that particular context, in that ritual. And I don't know if you've come across, there's someone called Monica Bilskite who writes a lot about protopian futures, and there's a big community that she works with as well. But, that creating a positive, world that gets better step by step, but gets better through things like ritual, gets better through things like, good decision making that is a little bit more, equal, and where you listen to all the voices, you do understand that there's plurality. But I mean, we've almost been beaten into, the Overton window, and we're sort of sat here with one arm tied behind our back, trying to raise families, do work, or whatever, right? Because suddenly, we've got taxes to pay, or we've got, heating bills to pay for, or places to go, or whatever. So the stories that have a well-earned optimism is a really interesting idea. But, does that sell in places like Hollywood? Does that sell when you're writing books? I mean, what was the last book, aside from your own writings, that did a really excellent job of that well-earned optimism and storytelling?
Well, let's see. You got me on the spot only in the sense that I am blanking on titles, but there's
for the listeners, Karl's just turned around to look at his reasonably extensive bookshelf.
There's, let's see, Brenda Cooper's Wilders. There's,
Brenda,
Ada Palmer's recent works, Too Like the Lightning, which is a utopia that fails, but fails in a really interesting way. There's Alex Delamonica's work. Again, since I don't have them at my fingertips,
sure.
titles are eluding me, but I can think of 5 or 6 books that I've read recently that actually do have that characteristic. And sometimes, again, it's when I look at this as a design question, interesting answers pop out. So something I wrote in the hieroglyph anthology was that our problems are not the physics of global warming. The problem is not ecosystem collapse. It's not energy. It's not. We know how to fix all of the problems that face us. There is only actually one problem that humanity faces, and that is how we govern ourselves. Because if we were making the right decisions, individually and collectively, we would not be in the situation that we're in. So all you have to do to get a well-earned optimism going is to say, well, how do we start to talk about better decision making and start investing in better decision making and studying it and actually implementing it. If this is our great challenge, it's our only great challenge. Everything else is tractable once we have that. And how much do we need to spend on it? Not nearly as much as we spend on nuclear fusion or rockets, right?
Right.
So it is possible to be optimistic in the sense that you know what can be done, and that there's no real impediment to doing it. It's just a matter of getting enough people to say, "Oh, yeah, all right, let's do that." And this is a great sort of example of it. I want to write, before I finish my writing career, I want to write a novel about the future of government. And it's going to be an optimistic novel because there's a lot of work to be done, right? A lot of things that we can do.
Yeah. Actually, when I ran the Dark Futures event last year, I didn't get speakers in like I normally do in my Dark Futures events, just to let you know. Some people call them the Black Mirror of TED Talks, but it's like typically five speakers, 15 minutes, talk about a hidden system in the world that we weren't aware of. And I've done it like all over North America, San Francisco, Toronto, Vancouver. It started off with typically started off with a pub conversation about weird things that happen in the world and sort of turned into this thing. But last year, Dark Futures, I did a bit of an intro, said, sorry, we're not doing it this year. Here's a virtual event. And all I played was Barbara Marx Hubbard's 1984 nomination speech for her as the Vice President of the United States. Have you seen that at all?
No.
Okay, I'm going to have to send that to you. So she talks. So she got enough votes to be heard at the National Democratic Convention, and everyone was like, "Who are you?" And anyway, a security guard helped to get on the stage, and through the crowds and all the bureaucracy that was trying to stop her from getting on stage. And she, for about 10-15 minutes, she spoke about creating the Office of Peace, which counteracts the Office of the President, right? Which is the Office of War. And it's kind of hugely optimistic, that conscious evolution and that big sort of movement. Yeah, Barbara Marx Hubbard, it's like really great. And when I took over Futurist.com from Glenn Heemstra, and Brenda Cooper's part of the think tank at Futurist.com as well, it was a lot of thinking about what people like Barbara Marx Hubbard was doing, and it went beyond governance to like the healing of the human spirit. Because the world's been created by war and taxes, which is created by ego, which is created by trauma, and it's cyclical, right? And we've seen that over the years, right? And
yeah, and I think being aware of all of that, I think in terms of simple design interventions. So everybody's talking about cryptocurrency, particularly Bitcoin these days.
Yeah.
But you can design different kinds of cryptocurrencies. And I designed one called Gwycoin, which is a potlatch currency.
Right.
So if you have too many Gwycoins in your wallet, they will start quietly redistributing themselves to empty wallets. What it does is create a guaranteed income and a wealth redistribution system without the intervention of some kind of nanny government.
Right.
And for every coin that you give away or that is taken away from you by this system, you get an untransferable, a non-fungible token called an eminence point.
Right.
So the richer you get, the more you give away. The more you give away, the more eminence you have. And it's permanent, right? So I've written a couple of stories that use this idea. Yeah. But this is just a simple design intervention that in one sort of mechanical way cuts across about 100 different social issues.
Right.
And that's the kind of thing that, as a science fiction writer, sort of with the soul of a foresighter, I guess, I like to do these days.
It's interesting as well. If you take that exact same idea and flip it on its head and put it in a totalitarian government, suddenly you've got the social credit system in China as well, right?
Right. And which is why it's so important to flip it the other way so that people see it doesn't have to be that. So it's great to warn us against the social credit system, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. These technologies can be deployed one way or the other. And again, they can be quite utopian.
So this conversation is hugely interesting because, we're talking about resilience in the face of surprise. We're talking about those narratives that are hugely important as well. That narrative is everything on what we need to, develop as humans. And I'm a new father, and I'm going to have to tell stories to my kid, and I sit down and tell him, read stupid books at him, but I'm going to have to read more important, human, stories and narratives as we go forward. But we kind of ended on this area of like one solution when in a particular frame and context of equality and access and durability and resiliency can be incredibly powerful, but it can also be flipped very, very easily to work against us as well. And it ends up back to what you're talking about, the importance of governance and the people that are pulling the levers of power in a way, and to what end. I always like to think about what if we didn't have to earn money, and what if we just went through our lives doing what we do. Well, then suddenly the fabric of everything that we've been taught in terms of status and wealth, education and whatever sort of starts to crumble a little bit. Go 10,000, 12,000 years ago to was it the first city, Uruk, I think it was called, where we started to formalize human society in a way, an agrarian society. It was about who has what and who doesn't. And there's a quote that when I'm writing my book, I've got it on my wall in front of me. The invention of the ship, which is a hugely hopeful metaphor, but a hugely hopeful thing for people trying to escape an island nation, is also the invention of the shipwreck. which is like this dichotomy that we have to live with.
Yeah, but again, shipwrecks do not invalidate ships.
Right, exactly.
And talking about Uruk and the post-money society, this is exactly what I was writing about in Stealing Worlds.
Right.
And there's several design interventions in there. And when you design the money, and people want to use that money more than they want to use the social credit version, and they can, then you build it and they will come kind of thing. In Stealing Worlds, it is a post-money society. You can never completely own anything. Ownership is always partial, but it already is in the real world, because you don't own flyover rights over your house, and typically not the mineral rights under it. Elinor Ostrom introduced the idea of rights bundles to describe this sort of thing. So in Stealing Worlds, there's bundles of rights attached to everything, and you can own various ones of those, but never everything. There is no once and for all economic status. You can be just in one game world, for instance, you can be rich, and in another game world on your PS4 or whatever, you can be poor.
Right.
This sort of moves that capability into the real world, and builds a utopia out of it. And I was not saying in that book that this was the way to go. I was saying you can do things like this.
Right.
And it's actually not that hard right now. We're living in a liminal moment when a lot of the technologies to do this sort of stuff exist and have not yet been stamped out by the powers that be. So again, there's earned optimism here, but it's a narrow window, just like our window to save so many of the species on the planet, that we have to take advantage of right now.
Yeah, and I think that's almost a perfect ending to this particular part of the conversation. I mean, like I say to everyone, we got to do this again, and we will do this again. And hopefully, because we literally don't live too far away from each other, we can actually have coffee or have lunch at some point in the not too distant future. I hope we live in the strangest province in Canada right now, but that's fine. But Karl Schroeder, I'd like to say thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your insights and your experience to talk to us about narratives, and also talk to us about that sort of the positive nature of creating something that can really inspire people to maybe challenge themselves, to have some interventions in their own lives, and maybe chart a course forward on a ship that hasn't sunk yet and will never sink into the horizon. So Karl, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
Okay, thank you.